And this one is a cooperative giant campaign game that has often been compared to Gloomhaven, but I think this one does do quite a few things differently. I think it borrows a lot of ideas from different games, but then brings them together in a very unique way. But in this game, each player is going to be taking the role of a pilot on a larger ship. But as I said, players are pilots, so each player will also have their own ship on that larger cruise ship that they'll be able to fly out into space individually and explore and attack various enemies. But what's neat here is that each of the ships will have special abilities along with the different pilots, and players can also upgrade or change their ships throughout the campaign. Players are going to be experiencing the game and discovering its narrative over 3 main acts with a ton of different scenarios to experience, but players aren't actually going to be playing every single scenario in this game because depending on your successes and failures and the decisions that the players make, that's going to determine which path you take through the narrative and determine which scenarios players actually get to experience. So even if you do play this a second time, you could end up experiencing some very different outcomes. Of course, all these different scenarios will be outlined in the campaign booklet, which is going to be walking you through the campaign and presenting you with your different options and decisions, and also instructing you how to set up the various boards depending on the type of scenario you get into. There are a whole bunch of different scenarios in this game with different win and loss conditions, and of course each of them are going to be providing more narrative as you play through them, but a common scenario is a space battle where players are going to be setting up the main board with some space debris or asteroids and enemy ships, and players will be trying to accomplish certain objectives while fighting against the various enemies. The way the game works is that players will be rolling a pool of dice, and then players will be assigning those dice amongst each other in order to activate the different areas of their ships, usually to do things like maneuver or attack the enemies or perform other special effects. But what's cool about this is that when you do attack an enemy, each player's ship could have access to different types of weapons that can have different effects. They could have different power levels or even do things like stun the enemy or deactivate some of the ship's systems, making them more vulnerable in different ways. Once all the players have performed their actions, you're then going to be moving into the enemies phase and drawing an activation card for each of the enemies still out on the board. The cool thing here is that all of the enemies can work very different from each other depending on the type or class of enemy you're going up against, because you're going to be drawing from a different deck of cards depending on the type of enemy you're drawing for. But this card is going to be dictating the behavior of the enemy, and you're just going to be resolving each of those cards' effects. The rounds continue like this until the players either win or lose that scenario, and then you're going to be following the campaign booklet to see what happens next. But I did mention that this is a game that offers different types of scenarios. What I meant by that is that not all your scenarios are going to look anything like this or even take place on a space battle board, because you can also go into scenarios that have you exploring the outer reaches of space, as players are going to be navigating through cards, matching the different numbers together and drawing the appropriate card in order to expand that map and explore more of what the space has to offer. Which brings us to another possible scenario where players can actually leave their ships and go out on foot, exploring different space stations or even the planets themselves, using the same tile system where players are going to be landing on a particular tile, and then exploring the edges of that, interacting with any points of interest, discovering different items, gear, or upgrades, or even enemies out on the planet's surface. Some of the planets can even have different buildings that players can enter, and of course players are trying to visit these planets for a particular objective, to gather different key cards, gain access to different areas, or make certain discoveries, and of course any of these could trigger different effects that could propel the narrative in different ways. This new edition of the game actually makes quite a few improvements to the game that I really love to see, because they put a lot of time and effort into revising portions of the rulebook and making the game easier and more streamlined to play. And they also worked on the space exploration and world exploration portions as well, introducing new ways to speed up certain aspects of those scenarios, allowing players to get back to their ship a little bit quicker. Along with all this, they're also going to be introducing a brand new expansion to the game called the Drones of Akarios, which is going to be introducing a bunch of new ships and pilots for players to play, but it's also going to be introducing a one-off standalone campaign that players can play separately from the core game. If this one sounds interesting to you, I do recommend checking it out and following along to get notified of that launch, because this will also get you a free legendary upgrade pack added to your pledge, which is going to add a bunch of extra cards that you'll be able to use for upgrades for your various ships. And I will have a link to the campaign in the description below.